guys, so as you probably know, I'm here today to talk to you about Killerton Chapel, its kind of history, its present uses and any potential future uses I've thought of. I sort of thought I'd do things a bit differently. I'm aware we're probably all a bit exhausted of digital communication this year, so traditional video it is. I'm doing it all handheld, so I'm hoping to get it all done in one continuous take, but if I don't, please bear with me. So yeah, the last few weeks I've been putting this together. Let me just turn this around. So, as you can see, this is a bit of a mad conspiracy theory diagram about everything to do with Killerton Chapel. I really wanted this presentation to demonstrate the interconnectedness of the chapel with key periods in history. So, starting in the centre here, each of these strings links us up. This is the beginning of the story. In the middle here we've got Killerton today, and over at the far side we've got Killerton's future. So if we follow this first little string from the blue pin across, we come to the beginning. Now the start of Killerton's story really begins with these two influential figures. So this handsome man is Sir Thomas Acland X. He worked with Charles Robert Cockerell to design Killerton Chapel. Now the process for this design began in 1836. I think there's correspondence between the two of them that goes back to the 1820s when Charles designed a cottage for Sir Thomas. So they were all already working together in an architectural sense. But yeah, 1836 is when the designs for the chapel really begin. Now the chapel was designed to replace this building here. So this represents the family chapel at Column John, which was becoming quite dilapidated in the 19th century, and the family was really in need of a new place of worship. So the inspiration for the chapel's design came from the design for the chapel of St. Joseph of Arimathea at Glastonbury. Now Glastonbury Abbey is quite a unique building. It's written about by William of Malmesbury, the medieval historian, in his book Antiquitate Glastonensis Ecclesiae. Now in that book he kind of cites the chapel as the oldest building in Britain. Precisely why Sir Thomas and Charles decided on this building as their design for the chapel is a little bit unclear. There are a couple of possible reasons. The first being, according to Historic England, it may have been actually a preference on the behalf of the architect, who is cited as saying that this chapel was the finest example of architecture of its time, so he certainly had an aesthetic preference for it. But another link potentially between Sir Thomas and Glastonbury Abbey comes from Sir Thomas's interest in overseas mission work. Now William of Malmesbury, our medieval historian on the left over here, cites Joseph of Arimathea as the first kind of Christian missionary who brings Christianity to ancient Britain. Now as I said, Sir Thomas Acland was incredibly interested in mission work overseas, so it's possible that he saw sort of an ideological similarity between himself and St. Joseph of Arimathea, or was at least very interested in this idea of him as kind of bringing the gospel to the heathens. And so I thought I'd do a little drawing here. This drawing here represents a digital reconstruction of the crypt of St. Joseph of Arimathea that's been produced by the archaeologists at Glastonbury Abbey, so I thought it would just be a useful way of kind of visually referencing that structure. Now, as I mentioned, Sir Thomas Acland has a lot of interest in mission work overseas, but he was also a keen abolitionist, which links him to this chap in the top here, as you can see, this bit of string. This man is Bishop Samuel Crowther. Now, he is originally from Nigeria. He's captured by Portuguese slavers in his early life when he's just 12 years old, and after that point he is freed by the British Navy and moves to Sierra Leone. Now in Sierra Leone, Bishop Crowther, well, his name isn't Bishop Crowther by then, but he is introduced to the English church, after which he moves to the UK to study at Cambridge and becomes a reverend, and then later becomes ordained as the first black bishop in Britain. Now his links with Sir Thomas centre largely on their joint interest in abolition, so there is quite a lot of newspaper evidence linking the two figures, and I thought, for example, both of them jointly attend meetings around kind of cementing, because abolition has already been legally binding in Britain, but around other parts of the world slaves are still not quite free, or where they are freed there's not any financial provision for them, so both of these figures are quite interested in working for increased black rights and increased slave freedoms. So yeah, he's quite an important figure. There's also evidence that suggests that he did visit Killerton Chapel. So he was there at the consecration, but most newspaper evidence sort of links him and Sir Thomas, or links him to the Ackland family more throughout these meetings set to either increase the abolition movement internationally or to establish mission work overseas. So sort of since this kind of colourful period, the chapel's beginning, the key figures that were involved, Killerton Chapel sort of settles down into more domestic use. So you get weekly sermons at Killerton, you get kind of anything you'd expect from a local community chapel. So throughout the the interest in raising money for overseas mission work continued far after Sir Thomas X's death. In 1898, there are charity fundraisers held in the chapel grounds to try and raise money for the establishment of various churches overseas. So yeah, the family interest in religious zealousy definitely continues throughout Killerton Chapel's history. It is still consecrated, but that kind of moves us towards the chapel's more recent history. So here we go. Since it was handed to the National Trust in 1944, Killerton Chapel has remained consecrated, as I said, and held services on a monthly basis until 1995. The chapel falls within Broadcliffe Parish, however the Broadcliffe parishioners currently attend their local church, St John the Baptist's. In terms of what went on at Killerton Chapel in the last 80 years, I know that weddings have been quite infrequent because you need a private licence to perform a wedding ceremony at Killerton, so very few have actually taken place there over the years. Who knows, perhaps it will survive to see more couples tie the knot, let's hope so. Funerals are similarly infrequent, as it's largely visited by tourists to Killerton House. It's quite unlikely that parishioners would feel spiritually connected enough to the church to kind of desire their funeral to be held there. The chapel has seen other events, so represented by these little singing people here. So local members of Broadcliffe Primary School have held their nativity concerts there. I was informed that in the past they've also had weekly choir groups come to sing in the chapel. So it has had sort of quite traditional but quite, I don't want to say frequent, but quite regular use in one sense or another. Obviously its main use is also as a tourist attraction as part of Killerton House. So yeah, that brings us sort of to Killerton's future uses. Killerton Chapel, what lies ahead? So when imagining future uses for Killerton Chapel, I felt it was important to think of ways to reimagine the space which paid tribute to its unique history and the history of the family and the community it served. So besides striking a balance between the imaginative and the respectful, I also had to consider the restrictions relevant to a Grade 1 listed building. So due to the chapel's fantastic architecture, it is a site of historic interest, and it is Grade 1 listed. So in terms of thinking through future uses, I had to be very aware of the types of restrictions put on buildings of this kind. Historic England outlines many restrictions, most of which are specific to individual properties. Generally, renovation which alters the building structurally requires further planning permissions, so I decided it would be more prudent for any future projects to operate as modules or installations. That way they offer a potential for quick changes to the chapel's interior and in no way pose a threat to the building itself. I thought taking this approach would just really help to kind of come into line with the restoration work that is going to be going on at Killerton Chapel. So linking kind of that introduction, this chart here is a list of all the ideas I had. So the first idea, I was sort of inspired by what goes on at Buckland Abbey. So there they have this wonderful education centre for children and school groups to kind of come and learn, kind of do hands-on learning around the structure of the abbey and the sort of events that go on there and the work the monks do. So I thought that a similar kind of education centre at Killerton could host school groups as part of Educational Living Histories trips. In this side of the chart, I've discussed the work required. So you'd have to create asset packs, you'd have to create a booking schedule to bring in living historians or people to deliver talks. There would also be quite a lot of physical activities that needed to be commissioned, so I thought perhaps you could do dress up, you could do architecture puzzles, reading challenges, treasure hunts, just all of these things that really get little children to engage with history in really exciting and inspiring ways. Obviously there's also the relevant health and safety planning and marketing to local schools to take into account with that. You probably can't quite read this, but it says the second idea I had is slightly more niche. It was sort of a kind of left of field thought. So I thought we could do some sort of higher education collaboration with architectural colleges. I mean, I've been reading so much about the fact that this building is so unique architecturally that I thought it would be quite interesting to host seminars for civil engineering students or architectural students there. Evening events could be designed for those interested in architectural heritage. Obviously, this is a bit easier to plan. It just requires a bit of collaboration with academics, a booking schedule again, kind of marketing within universities and the necessary equipment, and obviously health and safety. Now, the fourth idea I was actually really quite fond of. This was the idea to kind of transform the interior space into an indoor garden. So it would be an opportunity to display the splendour of indoor plants, converting a church environment into a peaceful yet visually stunning indoor garden to successfully integrate the space into the wider grounds, repurposing it as an extension of the outdoors. It could be used as a nursery storage for the grounds team if, for example, they're looking to increase biodiversity or reintroduce native plant species. This could even include a coffee stand outside so that people may sit indoors, out of the weather, and enjoy refreshment amongst nature. I'm sure you can imagine the type of work required for this, but obviously there'd be quite a lot around plant maintenance, collaborating perhaps even with a designer to create a beautiful interior full of plants, and some educational assets might be helpful. Something sort of tying it to the grounds could also link in with conversations around the environmental benefit. I know the National Trust properties across the country have a lot of land usually attached to them, and in light of the fact that the National Trust has recently come under fire for selling off some woodland in another part of the country, I think really focusing on what they can do to improve biodiversity would be really beneficial. And I just thought coffee would kind of add an extra dimension to that, make it a place to kind of stay in, to enjoy, to take your time over, rather than just to sort of look round and then leave. Now, the last idea I had is actually the idea I'm the most fond of. Now, this is inspired by a lot of the research I was doing around how churches have been altered or restored, and it involves the formation of an inclusive bookshop. So I thought this idea kind of also tied the future uses of the chapel to its history. I've talked a lot today about how Thomas X was very interested in overseas mission work, how abolitionism and black rights were sort of at the forefront of a lot of his political work. So I thought an inclusive bookshop stocking titles by women writers and minority ethnic groups could be installed to reflect the Ackland family's role in the abolition movement and to celebrate the important black and ethnic minority figures who continue to fight for racial equality today. So, as I sort of mentioned earlier, whilst in this instance a lot of the mission work was actually supported by the Black Reverend Bishop Crowther, it's really important to remember that mission work for a lot of people in post-colonial nations represents an erosion of their native identity and really represents this crisis for them. It instilled a great deal of shame and was another tool for kind of colonial control and colonial oppression. Although a lot of the people that kind of supported this stuff thought they had the moral authority to do so, they thought that spreading the gospel was, the morally correct thing to do. It's actually the case that in many instances it was another tool to establish greater dominance on behalf of colonial powers. So I just thought this would be a really, really good way to kind of be respectful of that history and to really kind of not only connect with the direct experiences of the Ackland family, but to place the National Trust more sensibly within these discourses of social justice. I know the big house has kind of lately come under scrutiny, owing to a lot of the involvement of aristocratic families with slave ownership. So I really think the National Trust could capitalise on that kind of responsibility to acknowledge those histories that go unremembered in a lot of cases. Examples of churches that have been successfully converted into bookshops abound, really. I mean, this one is the Selexis Dominicanen in the Netherlands, and as you can see, it's got these beautiful kind of vaulted ceilings here, and all of these lines and lines of bookshelves. Obviously, this is an enormous cathedral space compared to what's available at Killerton, but I just thought the way it was laid out kind of combined really contemporary, just a really contemporary, modern feeling bookshop with the beautiful old architecture, and it had just a lovely effect. Obviously, in order to adapt this for Killerton Chapel, you'd have to be really careful that all bookshelves constructed were removable. I've written over here again in the work required section, so I thought, construct removable shelving, and then approaching black-owned independent book suppliers to see about stocking titles, and then create a plaque or a feature commemorating abolition which sensitively explains the necessity for using the National Trust's platform to promote black voices. So yeah, that's sort of it. That's what I came up with as the best idea. Here I've just sort of summed it all up. So considering the options listed above, the final option of installing a temporary inclusive bookshop seems both the most feasible and the most appropriate, given Killerton Chapel's ambivalent involvement with Black history. At once celebrating abolition whilst recognising the continuing harm of overseas mission work as a tool of colonial oppression responsible for eroding native cultural identities, an inclusive bookshop showcasing Indigenous Black writing from formerly colonised nations would symbolically reflect a commitment to representing alternative histories within the National Trust. A portion of proceeds may even be allocated for donation to international Indigenous rights charities to undo some of the harm caused by the Ackland family's financial endorsement of international mission work when the house was an active seat of aristocratic power. So yeah, that kind of brings us via this last string back to the beginning. So that's all the work I have done this week. My research paper outlines a few further lines for inquiry. It would be really interesting, for example, to learn how many National Trust properties or how many big houses of this kind of era of the early 19th century actually commissioned the creation of their own chapels. I'm not sure quite how common that practice is, but it would be interesting to find out. Beyond that, I think it would also be really interesting to kind of investigate the future of, the relationship between Sir Thomas and Glastonbury Abbey a little bit further. I'm sure there's far more digging to be done there, particularly in the correspondence between Sir Thomas and the architect. Yeah, it would also be lovely to try and find out a little bit more information about Samuel Crowther and how regularly he came to Killerton, whether it was just the one time during its consecration or whether he kind of frequented Killerton House. I just think that would be a really neat way of kind of connecting Black figures, people of colour, to the story of this fantastic building. So let me just try and spin you round so I can do a bit to say goodbye. All in all, I've really enjoyed this research project. I just wanted to thank you all for the opportunity, and I hope you all enjoy your summer.